For years, I was the family failure. The daughter my mother mocked over every holiday dinner while my sister Chloe wore the crown. They laughed to my face, saying, "You'll never have a house like your sister's," while I quietly worked 60-hour weeks in a cramped apartment they called a charity case. I couldn't believe the level of jabs I took, but what they didn't know was that I was sitting on a shocking secret. The truth is, my mother didn't just prefer my sister. She had cheated me out of my entire future to build Chloe's throne. I was backstabbed by the person who was supposed to protect me, discovering that my $45,700 college fund, money meant for my life, had been stolen by my own mother for Chloe's down payment. For 3 years, I stayed silent, playing the poor daughter role while I built a mountain of wealth and a plan for the ultimate payback. Then, I bought a mansion that makes my sister's house look like a shack, and I invited them over for tea to show them exactly what happens when karma finally comes to collect. Watch what happened when the exposed truth hit the table and my mother finally lost her voice forever. My name is Sydney. I'm 31, and I finally learned that blood isn't always thicker than water. Sometimes it's just colder. It was Easter Sunday at my aunt's place in Silver Lake, with 25 relatives gathered around a table that felt more like a courtroom than a celebration. My mother, Evelyn, cleared her throat, clinking her glass to ensure every single pair of eyes was fixed directly on me. Dad was traveling for work that weekend, which made my mother even bolder. She sighed with that performative pity she wears so well, loudly announcing that I was the only unsettled one left in the family tree. The room went dead silent as she lamented how heartbreaking it was that I still couldn't afford a roof over my head. Meanwhile, my older sister Chloe, Meredith when she wanted to sound refined, sat there like a crowned queen, smirking over her wine glass. Chloe had just bought a massive colonial estate, and my mother made sure to frame her as the gold standard of success. I felt the heat of humiliated stares burning into my skin, the weight of a family drama I never asked to star in. I sat there staring at my plate, feeling the crushing weight of being shamed in front of the people who were supposed to love me most. My mother kept going, calling it a tragedy that I lacked the drive Meredith possessed, making me the ultimate punchline of the afternoon. It wasn't just a comment. It was a public execution of my dignity, a way to keep me small while my sister stayed on her pedestal. I looked at Meredith's smug face and realized this betrayal went much deeper than a few mean words over ham. "Maybe if you worked as hard as your sister, Sydney, you wouldn't be a charity case," my mother whispered, loud enough for the entire table to gasp. I felt backstabbed by the very woman who raised me, realizing that in her eyes, I was nothing more than a failure to be mocked. Every relative started whispering, their pitying glances making me feel like I was drowning in a sea of lies. I wanted to scream, to tell them I was doing my best, but something in the air felt incredibly wrong. Then, I caught a glimpse of my Uncle Silas, who was looking at me with an expression that wasn't pity. It was pure, unadulterated guilt. He looked like he was holding onto a secret that was eating him alive, something shocking that didn't fit the narrative. As the laughter at my expense continued, Silas caught my eye and gave a subtle, frantic shake of his head, signaling me to stay quiet. I realized then that the truth about my life wasn't what my mother was preaching to the masses. The dinner ended with more jabs at my lack of ambition, leaving me feeling utterly cheated out of my own sense of self-worth. I left that house with my head down. But as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a text that changed everything instantly. It was Silas, asking if I could talk privately, claiming he had something I desperately needed to see regarding my past. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled over, sensing that a vengeance was about to be born from the ashes of this night. I met Silas in a dimly lit diner 2 towns over, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold my coffee mug. He didn't waste time with small talk. He just slid a weathered manila envelope across the table toward me. "Sydney, I can't watch them do this to you anymore. Not after today," he whispered, his voice thick with a heavy sense of justice. I opened the envelope and felt the world tilt on its axis as I saw my name on an old account. It was my college fund, the one my grandfather had started for me the day I was born, which I was told vanished in a market crash years ago. There it was, $45,700, sitting in a high-yield account until exactly 3 years ago, when the balance dropped to zero in a single day. My breath hitched as I saw the signature on the withdrawal slip. It was my mother's elegant, looping handwriting, dated just weeks before Meredith bought her house. My own mother had lied to my face for years, while she effectively robbed my entire future. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The money meant for my education, my head start in life, had been funneled directly into Meredith's down payment. I had been backstabbed by my own flesh and blood, stripped of my inheritance to fund my sister's lifestyle while I struggled. The betrayal was surgical, cold, and calculated, leaving me feeling more humiliated now than I had at the dinner table. My mother didn't just prefer Meredith, she had literally stolen my life to build her throne. Silas explained that he'd stumbled upon the records while helping my mother with her taxes, and the infidelity to our family bond had kept him awake for months. I looked at the numbers again. $45,700. A fortune that was supposed to be my safety net, now sitting in the floorboards of Meredith's home. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a heist, a family betrayal so profound it made my blood turn to ice. I realized I had been playing a game where the dealer was cheating the entire time. The shocking realization that my mother had been calling me a failure while holding the money she stole from me was a special kind of evil. She had cheated me out of my confidence, making me believe I was the problem when she was the one who had sabotaged my start. Every time she mocked my apartment or my old car, she knew she was the reason I didn't have more, and she loved it. A dark, quiet spark of vengeance began to flicker in the pit of my stomach, replacing the hurt. I tucked the documents back into the envelope, my mind racing through 1,000 ways to scream the truth from the rooftops right then. But Silas gripped my wrist, his eyes intense, and told me that if I moved too fast, she'd just find a way to flip the narrative. I needed a plan, a way to ensure karma hit her with the full weight of her own greed without her seeing it coming. I needed to be the ghost in my own story, watching and waiting until the moment was perfect. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the family group chats and the way my cousins looked at me during Sunday brunches. It became sickeningly clear that my mother hadn't stopped at the dinner table. She was running a full-scale PR campaign against my reputation. She had labeled me the family project, all while painting Meredith as the ultimate provider. The lie about my struggle was the foundation of her own social standing within the family. I overheard her on the phone one afternoon, telling Aunt Sarah that she was quietly helping me pay my rent because I was too proud to admit I was failing. It was a complete betrayal of reality, considering I hadn't taken a single dime from her since I was 18 years old. She was building a narrative of my incompetence to hide the truth of her own theft. I realized then that my self-worth was being traded for her ego in every conversation she had. She would praise Meredith's new granite countertops in the same breath she'd ask if I needed leftovers to get through the week. A constant stream of jabs. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, making the entire family believe I was a burden while she held the keys to the money she stole. This family drama was her favorite stage, and I was being forced to play the role of the pitiable broke daughter. I watched as my relatives nodded in sympathy for her, fueled by the cheated version of my life. The backstabbed feeling didn't go away, but it transformed into a cold, analytical observation of how she manipulated everyone around her. She would mention Meredith's hard work as if my 60-hour weeks at the firm didn't exist, effectively erasing my effort from the family history. It was a deliberate attempt to keep my dignity in the dirt so I wouldn't feel empowered enough to ever question her authority. She wanted me to feel lucky just to be invited to the table. I found out through a cousin that my mother had even suggested I move into Meredith's basement until I got on my feet, a suggestion that made my skin crawl. The level of infidelity to the truth was staggering. She wanted me to live in the house that my own stolen money helped buy. It was the ultimate power move, a way to keep her victim close and ensure I remained the charity case forever. My silence during these months wasn't weakness. It was the only way to protect my next move. Every time I felt like breaking down and screaming the shocking truth, I would go back to that manila envelope and look at her signature on the withdrawal. That ink was my fuel, the evidence that would eventually lead to the justice I was quietly building in the shadows of my failed life. I let her keep talking, let her keep building her web of lies, knowing that the higher she built it, the further she'd fall. The narrative was her weapon, but soon it would become her very own prison. I decided right then that I wouldn't give her another opportunity to see me sweat or hear me defend myself against her stories. I stopped responding to the pity texts and stopped showing up to the gatherings where she could corner me with her advice. My silence became my shield, a way of reclaiming my power without uttering a single word that she could twist against me. If she wanted a ghost, I would give her a ghost, but one that was haunting her bank accounts. I began tracking every single dollar I earned, every investment I made, and every hour of overtime I pulled at the office with a new, icy focus. My goal wasn't just to survive. It was to build a life so undeniably successful that her lies would eventually look like the delusions they were. I was playing the long game of revenge, working in the dark so my light would eventually blind the people who doubted me. I refused to let her see my self-worth ever again. For 3 years, I stayed silent. I fought the family betrayal with a spreadsheet and an ironclad will to succeed on my own terms. I worked brutal, soul-crushing hours, taking on projects that my colleagues were too afraid to touch, all while keeping my income a total secret. Every time I felt exhausted, I remembered the way Meredith smirked at that Easter dinner, and my vengeance would reignite. I was building a fortress of financial security that no one in my family could ever touch. My mother would call to check in, her voice dripping with fake concern, asking if I'd finally found a better job, or if I was still struggling at the bottom. I'd just give her short, vague answers, letting her believe I was barely staying afloat while I was actually outperforming everyone in my department. It was a calculated form of justice, allowing her to feel superior while I was quietly surpassing her in every way that mattered. The truth remained hidden, tucked away in my private ledgers and my heart. I watched from the sidelines as she continued to brag about Meredith's investments, knowing full well they were built on the foundation of my stolen college fund. I didn't flinch, didn't argue, and didn't show an ounce of the betrayal that was still burning in my chest. I was becoming someone they didn't recognize, a woman who didn't need their validation or their fake charity to know her own value. My silence was a wall she couldn't climb, no matter how hard she tried to bait me. The strategy was working. By not giving her a reaction, I was slowly starving her of the drama she craved to keep her narrative alive. She started to get frustrated, her jabs becoming more desperate and obvious to anyone who was actually paying attention. I knew that the karma I was inviting into the room was patient, and I was more than willing to wait for the right moment. I was no longer the girl who was shamed. I was the architect of my own coming storm. At work, I found a mentor named Elias, who saw past my quiet exterior and recognized the hunger for justice in my eyes. He pushed me to negotiate for what I was worth, teaching me that power isn't about who shouts the loudest, but who holds the most leverage. I stopped being just an analyst and started becoming a leader, someone whose name carried weight in rooms my mother couldn't even dream of. My dignity was being rebuilt through every successful deal and promotion. My income tripled within 18 months after landing 2 equity-based deals and a performance bonus that changed my entire trajectory. I kept the old sedan, kept the modest apartment, and funneled every extra cent into diverse investments that were growing at a rate that felt like payback. I was building a mountain of wealth in total silence, while my mother continued to tell the family I was barely getting by. The gap between her lies and my reality was becoming a canyon. I'd sit through dinners listening to Meredith talk about her expensive vacations, knowing I could buy her house twice over with my liquid assets alone. It was a strange, powerful feeling to be backstabbed, and then to realize you were actually the one holding all the cards. I didn't need to brag because I knew the truth was a ticking time bomb that I controlled the detonator for. I was reclaiming my life by becoming someone they could no longer understand or reach. Elias told me that the best form of vengeance is living well, but I knew the best form was living well and then showing them the receipts. I was no longer the girl who felt humiliated by her sister's success. I was the woman who was quietly funding an empire of her own. My mother's influence over my mind had vanished, replaced by a cold, unwavering confidence. I had turned my betrayal into the fuel for a fire that was about to burn their house down. Every promotion I earned was a secret victory, a private toast to the justice that was coming for every lie they ever told about me. I wasn't just working for a paycheck. I was working for the moment I could finally look my mother in the eye and watch her world crumble. I was building a life that was beyond their reach, a level of success that would make their golden child look like a participation trophy. The quiet power I felt was more addictive than any public praise. I started looking at real estate, not in the neighborhoods they frequented, but in the exclusive hills where the air was thinner and the views were infinite. I wanted a home that was a statement, a physical manifestation of the self-worth they tried so hard to destroy in me for years. I found a place that felt like it was built for a woman who had survived a war and won it on her own terms. It was time to stop hiding and start preparing for the grandest reveal of my life. I closed on a stunning architectural masterpiece in High Ridge, a hillside home with floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the entire valley like a watchtower. It was a house that screamed self-worth, a place where the sun hit the wraparound deck in a way that made everything else feel small. I didn't tell a soul until the day I moved my last box into the master suite that felt like a sanctuary. I had finally achieved the justice of having a home they said I'd never earn. The property was a fortress of glass and steel, a direct contrast to the charity case image my mother had spent years carefully cultivating. Standing on that deck, I felt a sense of reclaiming my narrative that was so profound it almost brought me to my knees. I was no longer the girl who was shamed for her lack of a down payment. I was the owner of a view that Meredith's Colonial couldn't touch. Every penny of that stolen fund was about to be answered for. I spent the first few nights in total silence, just watching the lights of the city below and thinking about the family betrayal that led me here. My mother's voice still echoed in my head, calling me a failure. But the cold touch of my marble countertops was the only reality that mattered now. I had built this from nothing, without their help and despite their sabotage, making the vengeance taste like the purest mountain water. I was ready to invite the wolves into my den and watch them realize they were the prey. I decided the time for silence was over. It was time for the truth to be served on a silver platter in the very home they thought I'd never have. I planned a small, intimate tea and invited only my mother and Meredith, framing it as a visit to my new place without giving an address. I wanted the shock to be physical, a visceral reaction to the reality that I had surpassed them while they were busy looking down on me. This wasn't just a house. It was a weapon of mass justice. The invitation was a trap, a calculated move to draw them into a space where they had no power and no lies to hide behind. I could imagine my mother's face as she realized her poor, struggling daughter was living in a mansion that made her own home look like a cottage. It was the ultimate payback for every dinner they ruined, and every lie they told to my relatives over the years. I felt a calm, steady resolve as I sent the text that would change our family dynamic forever. I've finally settled into a little place of my own. Would love for you to see it, I wrote. My heart steady and my mind sharp as a razor. I knew that once they crossed that threshold, the family drama would reach its final explosive act, and I would be the one holding the script. I looked out at the valley one last time as a failure, knowing that by tomorrow I would be the legend they could never explain away. The stage was set, the evidence was ready, and the Queen was finally home. I sent the coordinates to their phones on a Tuesday afternoon, purposefully choosing a time when I knew they'd both be together for lunch. I didn't include a photo, just the address of the High Ridge estate, and a simple note saying I'd have the kettle on at 4. The psychological game of vengeance had officially begun, and I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads as they tried to place the neighborhood. I knew they'd assume I'd moved into a cramped studio. I spent the afternoon preparing the living room, placing the manila envelope from Uncle Silas right on the center of the reclaimed wood coffee table. It looked innocent enough, just a few papers in a folder, but it was the evidence of the infidelity that would tear their world apart in minutes. I felt a strange sense of peace, a calm before the storm that only comes when you know you've already won the war. My dignity was no longer up for debate. It was about to be demonstrated. When the intercom buzzed at the front gate, I took a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of years of being backstabbed finally lifting off my shoulders. I watched the security monitors as my mother's modest SUV pulled up the long, winding driveway, stopping dead in its tracks as the house came into view. I could see them through the windshield, their mouths literally hanging open as they stared at the glass and stone structure. The shocking truth was hitting them before they even stepped out of the car. I opened the massive pivot door and stood there, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit that I had bought specifically for this moment of reclaiming my power. My mother looked like she had seen a ghost, her eyes darting from the infinity pool to the 3-car garage. Meredith was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped her designer handbag, realizing that her crown was suddenly looking very tarnished. Neither of them could find the words to speak as they walked inside. "Welcome to my home," I said, my voice as smooth as the silk of my blouse, offering them a smile that didn't reach my eyes. My mother tried to stammer something about how nice the rental was, still desperately clinging to the lie that I couldn't possibly own something this magnificent. I just laughed, a soft, dangerous sound, and led them toward the living room where the truth was waiting to be unmasked. The air in the room felt heavy with the scent of impending justice. They sat on the edge of my Italian leather sofa, looking like intruders in a world they were never meant to conquer, their confidence completely shattered. I served the tea in silence, letting the opulence of the room do the talking for me while they struggled to process the scale of my success. I could see the wheels turning in Meredith's head, the panic setting in as she realized I wasn't the charity case anymore. It was time to stop the pleasantries and let the family betrayal finally come to light. Meredith looked like she was about to have a full-blown panic attack right there on my rug. She kept glancing at the high-end finishes and the expansive view, her face a mask of pure envy and confusion. My mother, Evelyn, was still trying to maintain her concerned parent act, but her voice was shaking as she asked how I could afford a resort like this. The lies she'd told herself for years were finally colliding with a reality she couldn't manipulate. "I have to call Dad," Meredith whispered, her voice cracking as she pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen in a desperate search for stability. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and the realization that she had been cheated by her own arrogance. I watched her walk toward the glass wall, her silhouette small against the massive horizon I had earned with my own sweat and tears. She was seeing the end of her reign as the successful daughter. My mother grabbed my arm, her grip tight and frantic, accusing me of doing something illegal or dangerous to get a house like this. It was her last-ditch effort to keep me in the box of failure she'd built for me, a final act of family betrayal that only made my resolve stronger. She couldn't accept that I had outworked her sabotage, so she had to turn my success into a crime. I pulled my arm away, feeling the cold fire of justice burning bright. Meredith was on the phone now, her voice hushed and frantic as she told my father he had to come over immediately, that something was terribly wrong with Sydney's new place. I just leaned back against the kitchen island, watching them unravel like a cheap sweater, feeling more in control than I ever had in my life. The humiliated daughter was gone, replaced by a woman who knew exactly how much she was worth and exactly how much they owed her. The karma was finally in the room. "You need to explain this, Sydney. You've lied to us about everything," my mother shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red as she realized she had lost the narrative she loved so much. I didn't say a word. I just pointed toward the manila envelope on the table, my expression a stone-cold mask of indifference to her manufactured outrage. I was done being the victim of her backstabbed tactics, and I was more than ready to let the paperwork do the screaming for me. The sound of another car pulling into the driveway signaled that the rest of the family was arriving exactly as I had planned. Meredith looked out the window and saw my father and Uncle Silas walking toward the door, her face turning a ghostly shade of white as she sensed the trap closing. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the truth in my hands. The moment of absolute payback had finally arrived at the gate. As my father and Silas entered the room, the tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. My mother tried to launch into a frantic explanation of how I was hiding things, but Silas stepped forward, his face set in a grim line of justice. He didn't look at her. He looked at me and gave a small, affirming nod that told me it was time to end the charade once and for all. I slid the documents out of the envelope and spread them across the table. "This is the truth about why I couldn't afford a home 3 years ago, Dad," I said, my voice steady and echoing through the high ceilings. I pointed to the withdrawal date, the exact same week Meredith put the down payment on her colonial, and then to the signature that clearly belonged to my mother. The room went deathly silent as my father picked up the paper, his eyes widening as he processed the $45,700 theft. The family betrayal was no longer a secret. Meredith looked like she wanted to disappear into the floorboards, her face a mask of shamed realization as she saw the proof that her success was built on my stolen future. My mother tried to claim it was a loan she intended to pay back, but the bank statements showed no repayment plan and a direct transfer to Meredith's account. I watched as my father's expression shifted from confusion to a deep, burning anger directed right at the woman he'd trusted. This was the ultimate payback. "You told me that money was lost in the crash, Evelyn," my father whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the betrayal he was finally seeing clearly. My mother started to cry, those fake, manipulative tears she used to get her way, but this time, nobody moved to comfort her. The shocking nature of her greed was laid bare for everyone to see, and the charity case narrative she'd built around me evaporated in an instant. I felt a surge of self-worth. I looked at Meredith, who was staring at her own hands, realizing that she had been an accomplice to my infidelity of trust by accepting money she knew wasn't hers to take. She tried to apologize, but the words felt hollow and thin against the backdrop of the years I spent struggling and being mocked by her. I didn't want her apologies. I wanted the record set straight, and I wanted my justice to be as permanent as the ink on those bank statements. The power dynamic had shifted forever. I took the papers back, my movements slow and deliberate, and tucked them away as if they were the most precious jewels in the world. I looked at my mother, who was now silenced by the weight of her own betrayal, her influence over our family completely destroyed in a single afternoon. I had won, not by screaming or crying, but by documenting the darkness and bringing it into the light of my own hard-earned success. The truth had finally set me free from their lies. My mother sat there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but not a single sound of justification could escape her throat. The power she once held over me, the ability to make me feel small with a single glance, had completely vanished in the presence of the truth. She looked around my magnificent home and finally saw it for what it was, a monument to my resilience and a graveyard for her manipulations. The silence was the most powerful justice I had ever experienced. I stood up, my height feeling like it had doubled, and looked at each of them with a calm that signaled the end of the war. I told them that from this day forward, I was no longer the character they got to write in their twisted family drama. If they wanted to be in my life, they would enter as guests who respected my boundaries, not as narrators who felt entitled to my story or my money. I was reclaiming every part of myself that they had tried to steal. Meredith tried to reach out to me, her eyes filled with a desperate need for forgiveness, but I stepped back, making it clear that my self-worth was not up for negotiation. I told her that she would have to live with the knowledge of what she took, just as I had lived with the weight of being backstabbed for so long. The karma of her own choices was now her burden to carry, and I was finally unburdened by her expectations. I was a woman who had built her own gates. My father walked over and hugged me, A long, silent embrace that felt like a bridge being rebuilt over a chasm of betrayal. He whispered that he was proud of me, not for the house, but for the strength it took to survive the lies he had been too blind to see. It was a moment of pure emotional justice that I didn't even know I needed until it happened. The invisible daughter was finally seen, and the woman who had robbed her was finally invisible. I led them to the door, my movements graceful and final, letting them know that the tea was over, and so was the era of my submission. As my mother walked past me, she wouldn't even meet my eyes, her face a mask of the very humiliated shame she had tried to drape over me for a decade. I closed the massive pivot door and felt the click of the lock echo like a final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I was finally alone in my palace of vengeance. I sat on my deck as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and deep violet, feeling the peace of a hard-won victory. I had learned that silence is a strategy, that the truth is the ultimate weapon against manipulation, and that boundaries are doors with much better locks. My life was finally my own, built on the solid ground of my own making, and no one would ever be able to tell me who I was again. This was my justice, and it was beautiful. The weeks following the tea were a whirlwind of shifting alliances and a total collapse of my mother's standing within the extended family. Word of the truth spread like wildfire through the group chats, and for the first time, the calls I received weren't filled with pity, but with sincere apologies. Relatives who had once mocked me were now asking for my advice, realization dawning on them that they had been cheated into believing a lie. The karma was thorough, and it was relentless. Meredith reached out several times, eventually sending a long, rambling letter admitting she knew the money came from my fund, but was too afraid to lose her golden child status to speak up. It was a pathetic confession of betrayal, but it was the start of her own painful journey toward accountability. I didn't offer her an easy out, but I didn't shut the door entirely. I just kept the distance necessary to protect my own self-worth. I was finally the one setting the terms. My mother tried one last time to play the victim, sending out a mass email about how material wealth had changed me, but nobody was buying her family betrayal scripts anymore. She had lost her voice because she had lost her credibility. Silas quietly apologized for staying silent so long, and I told him this wasn't about guilt. It was about choosing sides when truth shows up. I felt a strange sense of pity for my mother, but it was a distant emotion that no longer had the power to hurt my dignity. I focused on my career and my new home, turning the space into a sanctuary of creativity and peace that reflected the woman I had become. The justice of my success was a quiet, daily hum that reminded me of how far I'd come from that Easter dinner in Silver Lake. I started mentoring other young women who had been backstabbed by their own circumstances, teaching them the same lessons of silence and strategy that saved me. My healing was found in helping others find their own strength. The 3 lessons I walked away with were etched into my mind. Silence is a weapon when used correctly. The truth always outlasts the lie, and boundaries are the only way to keep your peace. I realized that reclaiming my life wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about the freedom to never have to explain my value to anyone ever again. I was whole, I was powerful, and I was finally the architect of a future that was built on a foundation of total honesty. I look at the keys to my home every morning and remember the girl who felt shamed and broken, and I promise her that we will never go back to that place. The vengeance is over, replaced by a deep, unwavering sense of contentment that can only come from standing in your own truth. My family may be fractured, but I am finally solid. A woman who turned a betrayal into a bridge to a better life. I am Sydney, and I am finally, truly, at home. This story is a reminder that your self-worth is never defined by the lies people tell about you, even if those people are your own family. I want to know, have you ever been backstabbed by someone you trusted, only to find the strength to rebuild your life in total silence? What was your house on the hill moment where you finally got the justice you deserved after being humiliated? Drop your city and the local time in the comments. and let's talk about how you turned a family betrayal into your greatest victory. I'm reading every single one of your stories because I know how much it hurts to be the invisible one. If this story resonated with you or gave you the spark to start reclaiming your own narrative, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now. We're diving deep into more tales of vengeance, karma, and the kind of payback that only comes to those who are patient enough to play the long game. Don't let anyone else hold the pen to your life story. Stay tuned for more insights that will help you turn your scars into your greatest strengths. Remember, boundaries aren't just walls. They are the keys to a house that no one can ever take from you again.